Good afternoon, Brian.
How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing good.
Good. Um, yeah, I'm just thinking we have some exciting topics coming up. Hopefully, if we stay on schedule, we'll have Paul Fenn next week, and really enjoyed the pre-meeting with him just now, and he's an energy policy expert who's also got a philosophical bent and an academic bent and thinks deeply about things. So
Super
I think it's
articulate.
going to be a
Yeah.
super articulate, going to be a great conversation.
Yeah, and the little bit that I had from reading the part of his book, there were some ahas for me. Some like, I didn't know you could do that. And so I'm always excited when we have a guest that kind of right away stretches my model of what's possible. And
Yeah,
and
that's
then,
what we're
he's
here
been
for.
quite successful at doing that and has actually changed things in a number of places, which we'll get into with him, which will be very cool. So anyway, stay
Yeah,
tuned, folks.
yeah. Um, so what I thought we might talk about today, if it grabs your fancy, is the idea of fragmentation. And I saw a quote from, I think it was Jon Haidt, the guy from NYU, from the Stern School, who's now on a crusade to get phones out of schools. But previously, he founded the Heterodox Academy and tried to increase viewpoint diversity in organizations, and also co-wrote The Coddling of the American Mind with, I think, Greg Lukianoff,
Interesting. Yeah.
who's the head of FIRE, right? The free speech advocacy group. So Jon Haidt tweeted something about, if you want to accomplish anything in life, you need to regain your attention, not fragment it and give it away. And that's such a important element in how we're going about things these days,
The myth of
that
multitasking.
that's part of it. And also, we were talking about reading in a recent episode, and I think that reading has sort of gone by the wayside as we've become more attached to our devices, which fragment our reality continuously. So this, like, what is fragmentation? I think there are a few descriptions and definitions of that can be useful, and then what do we do about it? Because we can't just shut all these devices off, I think, or maybe we can, but yeah, I'm curious to kind of hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah. Well, you remember I described it before as the modern world and all these distractions is kind of like that hall at the Shaolin Temple that had all the booby traps and all the things, and you only were completed when you made it out at the end and passed that test. There is something, and that the parallel to kung fu there is actually pretty direct. I know that if I can manipulate my opponent's attention, I can probably successfully manipulate their bodies. And I think there's probably a general rule of thumb there in some way. It's certainly, when we're domesticating animals, there's certainly something that goes on there, right? Now, the simplest way to understand that, I think, is I'm flashing back on Sheldon on an episode of The Big Bang Theory.
I never really watched
Oh,
that.
okay.
I've seen some clips, but yeah,
Well, he's
go
got the
for it.
roommate, and I think he's got, and it's, if I'm remembering this correctly, which I may not be, but as I recall, he had like M&Ms and M's and a squirt bottle, and whenever his roommate did something he wanted to encourage, he would give him an M&M, and whenever he sat in the wrong place or something, he would give him the squirt bottle, which is that Skinnerian, named after B.F. Skinner, right? That conditioning, basically,
Carrot and the stick, aversive, and
the whip and the carrot.
yeah. What's the opposite of aversive? I
Uh,
can't remember,
yeah,
but
but yeah, that basically, you know, like I knew a guy back in the day. And he was a crazy character, not a typically religious character, but he would always say that it was important to say grace. And his reasoning was, he said, because when you're eating, what you're doing is you're rewarding the beast. And if you're going to reward the beast, before you do that, you should put your mind on higher things. And so that the beast gets associated with the higher things and not just a direct fulfillment of our lower desires, right? So, well, that's an interesting kind of a component there. Doesn't really have anything to do with the supposition of a deity. It just says that it acknowledges that we have an animal nature and that we have a higher nature. That image before of dangling between the beasts and the gods. And so we know that our consciousness is actually manipulatable through those lower portals. And I think I've mentioned before about the connection between blood sugar and consciousness. And your blood sugar goes low, you go to sleep. And that is one of the things we use in martial arts, right? And I'm talking about, you do this right, they're unconscious in 1,000. That's that vital. So the idea that the regulation of blood sugar would manipulate my consciousness is not a huge leap. So we need to be aware, and this is part of the idea also with kung fu training, is that you're going to hold a stance, and what's going to happen is the beast, the body, is going to start sending you messages. It's like, bro, your leg hurts. Why don't you go sit down over there? Your leg won't hurt. Then you have to say, no, beast. I need that leg to hurt right now because for the good of the whole enterprise, that leg needs to hurt. Right. But now I'm in direct conflict with the beast. And what's going to happen in the next minute? The other leg's going to hurt. Right. And we're going to go through a process. And it's actually, this is what is referred to in the Kung Fu lineages as eating bitter. And it's a reference to taking Chinese medicinal herbs, which are often bitter herbs that you don't want to take, but you have to take them because your voice of brilliant wisdom knows that it's better for you to take them. Just like your voice of brilliant wisdom has to tell the beast, we're going to stand here for another few minutes because that's what serves our higher purpose. So we're going to find all sorts of things that are going to want to bait us away from our higher purpose. That's like almost the name of the game. So, I mean, you got to unfold that. If I'm pursuing my higher purpose, and that's really a fulfillment of who I am, then everything that comes in the way that tries to knock me off of that really isn't serving my higher goals. And so I want to be clear about that. And which doesn't mean that everything that I do is always going to be like, sometimes I'm going to take a break. Sometimes I'm going to maybe allow myself a recharge time, but that's different than being blown entirely off course, or to have some other agenda put above my own agenda. There's this idea that magic is often represented by the pentangle, right? Or the five-pointed star, and that's the pent is the five in the pentacle, right? So the traditional interpretation of that is that those 5 points represent spirit and the four elements. When the one point is pointed up, that point represents spirit and it's on top. And the other four elements are below spirit. So spirit is in control of the beast. When we flip it upside down and we put the four on top of the one, now the beast, literally in this case, right, is on top of spirit, which is not the way we want it. Danger, Will Robinson, danger. So, this is a very pragmatic thing, though, because there's always this conversation of, knowing maybe what would be best for us or what would further us a little more along our agenda, and what really is a sidetrack. And we do have to exert a certain amount of will and focus and desire for that higher end to make the choice. Because, say it with me, it's the choices that we make that really make us who we are, right? And how does it do that? Because if I make the choice to pursue my higher end, I become who I am in the higher sense. And if I pursue the thing that distracts me and I make those choices, then that actually thwarts who I am if I were to like capitalize those letters. So, really, this isn't just a snappy line, right?
So I want to blow up the second half of that statement a little bit, because you were saying something a couple minutes ago about, if we're not serving the agenda of kind of pursuing our own higher purpose, then we have to be cognizant that we might be serving another agenda. And that made me think of the algorithm. And when I say the algorithm, I guess I'm creating an amalgam of all of the algorithms that we're subjected to.
The
You know,
algorithmic sphere.
really, through social media and the fast news cycle. Those are kind of like the main drivers that I think of. But it makes me curious about what algorithms predated the internet. But we don't have to go there yet. But the algorithm, I think, sort of has an agenda that that not only does it want your attention, but it needs to monetize your attention. And
Mm.
that makes me think of it, the algorithm, as both a metaphor and a literal parasite. So it kind of, if we allow ourselves to be fragmented, we're allowing ourselves to be vampired in a way. I'm curious how that lands with you.
I think that a lot of things are like that. For example, tobacco, we make use of it ceremonially. And when we use it ceremonially, then it is in the service of our intent and will, and in every element of the way it's used. But then there's a lot of people that have a different relationship with tobacco, and the tobacco starts to run the beast, right? And now will has to intervene. Where what's enough? What's too much? How do I regulate the beast's relationship with this tool? And I think that's the case with all tools. There's always some way that they can bite you. And there's always a way that they can wrestle for, think of the guy at the end of the fire hose. Right? And like there's so much power here that if he doesn't set himself up right with the appropriate stance, it's going to knock his ass all around the place. Okay. Now, that whole sentence was all metaphorical, of course. Stance, the power, the flow, getting your butt knocked around. And then, what is the stance that we take so that we don't get buffeted around? What is that rootedness and what do we root in, right? Well, I've been reading a lot these early phenomenologists, and they really dive into the topic of intentionality. And intentionality really is right there, cheek and jowl with consciousness itself, so to speak. And it's involved not just with the core of mind, but I think it's also involved with identity in mysterious ways. And it's certainly involved with our encounters with the world. And so being conscious of our intentionality, understanding that it's something that we develop and that develops us. Intentionality is really at the root of things. It's at the root of what we do when we get up in the morning and where we go and why we go there. So yeah, there's a contest on for it for sure. And like I said, when I'm fighting an opponent, if I can manipulate his attention and his consciousness, then I can befuddle his ability to successfully manifest his intentionality, to make it clear. So, I guess there's a lot of different strategies to that, you know? Did we have we had yet the conversation of the 3 ways to slay a demon? Did we do that in one of the episodes? The the Vajrayana, the Hinayana, and the Mahayana?
Ooh, now that you mention it, with the Indian words, I think so, but refresh it. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
basically, this was a lecture that I heard from a Tibetan Lama about slaying demons, and that basically there's 3 approaches. There's the great river boat, which is the Mahayana. There's the small river boat, which is the Hinayana, and then there's the adamantine or diamond vessel, vehicle, or riverboat, and that's the Vajrayana. So the Mahayana way is a way that I have often associated with the 12-step program. The demon in that case would be alcohol or drugs, whatever the issue is. And the idea is basically you learn the demon, you learn its name, you learn where it lurks, and you don't go there. And you just apply your will, you stay away, and you're good to go. And then the Hinayana approach is a smaller riverboat, so this is not as easily applied by everybody. And the Hinayana approach is basically you go where you will go and you don't avoid it, you don't seek it out, you just follow your path. And if it doesn't show up, great, smooth sailing. If it does show up, so be it. Then it's going down mano a mano. And then we're going to fight it out, and the best entity will win. And then there's the Vajrayana. And the Vajrayana is sometimes described as the straight upward path. And the Vajrayana idea says you learn the demon, you learn its name, you learn where it hangs out, you go there, you kick its ass, and you take on all of its power as your own. And the idea is not that you know you're going to pick one of these and then every demon you're going to face with that same strategy. The idea, I think, at least my interpretation of that, was that based on where you are on the path, you're going to have to do triage and you're going to have to categorize demons into those 3 categories. And the bigger ones that you know you're just going to get slapped down by, those are the ones you use the Mahayana approach. And the ones in the middle, you can do the Hinayana, and the ones that you can dominate and take on their power, then those are the ones that you do. And as you might have experienced in ceremonies, that's a progressive curriculum. There were things that I could recognize in some of my very first few ceremonies that just punked me. I mean, they just kicked sand in my face in every which way. And then I remember recognizing them somewhere in the 10 years that followed. And it was like this tiny little mouse thing, you know? It was like, how did that thing punk on me? How could that thing have taken my lunch money and freaked me out so much? Whew, go away. Whew, and you're gone, right? It's gone. And but it hadn't really changed. I'm not sure that these involutionary creatures really change, but I had changed. My progressive curriculum had meant that now I could Vajrayana that thing without thinking twice. But in the beginning, years before, maybe I needed to give it a little wider berth, or I had to negotiate some learning curve to be able to get over on it.
So in the Hinayana way, I'm curious if you could say more about what fighting it out mano a mano means. Um, in a ceremony, pretty clear on that, but in day-to-day life, I'm not yeah, I'm curious, like, how to take that metaphor to the ground.
If we were to look at it with the alcohol example, right? The Mahayana approach would say, okay, now that I'm not going to drink, hasta la vista to everybody that I used to hang out with when I drank, and all the places that I used to go when I drank, and the entire world that was supporting my drinking. I'm just gonna cut that all loose. And if somebody shows up who supports that, I'm just going to cut them out. And that's going to be maintaining my, you know, fortress of solitude, so to speak. But and sometimes that's that absolutely what needs to be done, you know. The Hinayana approach might be I'm going to go where I go. I'm going to do what I do. I'm not going to avert. I'm not going to attract. I'm not going to, you know, I'm just going to follow the path. And if there's people there and they have those behaviors, then that's okay. The fighting it out mano a mano says I'm not going to join them because I've already understood that the battle is over my will and my attention. And so even though I'm in the midst of people who are getting their will slapped around, I'm not going for that. That's going to be a harder environment than if you're just at home and there's nobody there to go, "Hey, you want one of these? You want one of these?" No, no. So what's going to happen is actually when you win that battle, you've got more personal power out of it, right? So I don't know, maybe the Vajrayana in that case would be working at the bar and saying, okay, I'm going to go see this thing every day. I'm going to do 40 hours a week seeing this thing. And I'm
Just
going
want to
to,
clarify, that's not a recommendation.
no, no, I'm just saying yeah, in the spectrum of exposure and non exposure and the reliance on personal power to to keep you in control over the beast. Yeah.
So we're going to come back to personal power in a second, but first, you used the phrase involutionary creature.
Right.
Say more.
Well, that's borrowed, I think, probably from Muni Sadhu. Very interesting character. I'll put him in the show notes if he hasn't been there yet, even if he has been. There's this idea within the white ceremonial magic tradition that creatures that are negative, that work to pull us down, are not precise. They're not contrary to God's will. So for example, within nature, when an animal dies, there are microorganisms that will show up to break it down into its residual parts to recycle the thing. And they are about breaking things down as much as us who they break down are we're about putting that all together in the first place. So as we focus to evolve, their job in the big picture is involutionary. It's to take things from a more complex, more advanced state and to break them down into lower vibrational parts and pieces. So they're moving down the ladder that we are hopefully moving up. And so there is a natural antithesis there, though it doesn't have to be personal, right? And I think
Okay.
that there's a bigger idea there that I think I'm trying to think, you know, the Gnostics had this idea, and I don't remember whether the idea is demiurge, but that there are forces at work that are involutionary, that aren't necessarily there to support our evolution.
Is the Facebook algorithm an involutionary creature?
No, I think that it's more of a passive environmental factor. Now, I would look past those when to the people that are determining those if you wanted to see where the will to push things one way or the other lies. I don't think it's in the machine. Yeah,
But to my earlier comment, I guess maybe it's oversimplifying, but the Facebook algorithm, its goal is to keep you scrolling so that the ads work.
sure.
And that strikes me as parasitic. And so I would think, yeah, it's part of the yin and yang of things.
Yeah.
But
I consider it from my seat as a precessional effect. So like my table saw, you could say that part of what it does is make sawdust. but I'm not there for the sawdust. I'm there for what's left after the sawdust. So, a precessional effect is, I'm using it the way Bucky Fuller uses it, which is defined as an action that's at right angles to the primary action. And I think the example that he usually gives is if I was to have, say, a like a little barrel that was filled with water, say, and it was rubber. And so I could pull the top or squish it down. Well, the primary action would be the pulling or the squishing, but the sides would bulge or would suck in at right angles to that primary motion, and so the bulging or sucking in would be considered a precessional effect, right? But in the same way, when a bee goes to get honey in a flower, it's going for its purpose, which is to get nectar, but it also happens to be pollinating flowers at the same time, which is the last thing on its mind. So the pollination we could call a precessional effect from the bee's seat. From the flower's seat, you might say feeding the bee is a precessional effect or a necessary to getting the pollen across. But so from my seat, yeah, they got to pay themselves, but I know that I have also an immune system that's and they'll say, "Oh, but we can get through your immune system of advertising." And it's like,
Well,
"Yeah,
I don't think your immunity qualifies whether it's an involutionary creature or not. Just
yeah,
like the creature
yeah,
could punk on you at the beginning of your tenure and couldn't 10 years later, but it's still the same creature.
sure." But in this case, I think it's more of a mechanism than a creature. I'm not su I mean, it's more like my table saw. It'll chew me up if I stick my fingers in there. But I know what it'll do, and I get what I want out of it. And and I think that that is more about me and my relationship with my own will, as opposed to the different distractions and how effective they are, because everything that's not God is a distraction, right? so it doesn't take an algorithm or a machine to serve that function. We've got plenty of those au natural.
Maybe we end up editing this out later, but I feel like I have to press the point because
Uh-huh.
my mental model is just different.
Uh-huh.
So your table saw wasn't developed with the intention of extracting your attention from you so that it could sell you stuff. Of course, they had to make a living. They built the table saw and they have to make a margin in order to sell it to you and feed their families. But the purpose of the algorithm is monetizing you, and the attention, the value that you get from it is the precessional effect, and and questionably the value you get from it, not just you, I mean, I'm sure you don't use Facebook like most people do, but the value that people get from it, they might tell themselves that they're more interconnected with people, but what's really happening is they're getting fragmented, to
Uh-huh.
Jon
Yeah.
Haidt's point,
Yeah.
right?
Well, there is actually a parallel to that with table saws, ironically, because a few years ago, somebody invented an electrical mechanism that you can have the table saw spinning at a really high speed, and you touch it with your finger, and it locks the blade instantly. And they show this with a hot dog, as I recall, and they can stop the blade with a hot dog without the hot dog getting cut, and it's not expensive. And so there was a lot of talk about this should be on every table saw that goes out, because here's the math. Here's the fingers, here's the hands, here's the da 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 da. Literally fragmenting. Talk about fragmenting. I'm talking sawing off body parts. You want to know what? Not a single table saw that I ever see has that breaking thing in there, because the table saw companies said,
the
That's
cost.
gonna make 25 bucks more cost to our table saw, and we're gonna sell this many less table saws, and so we're not gonna do it. So it's not like the table saw people are any more friendly. Uh,
I'm not saying it's an altruistic undertaking,
mhm. You're just saying
but
it's
I
less
don't.
invidious somehow.
Well, yeah, yeah. I think there's a transparent exchange of value, and the table saw costing them $25 more to make would be acceptable if the market would accept a price that's $35 higher, or whatever their margin needs to be,
Right,
for them to sustain the risk and cost of making their manufacturing process more complex, making their RMA process more complex, increasing their inventory, all of the incremental things that come with the table saw having the safety feature have to get passed on to the consumer. I don't have any problem with that.
uh-huh.
What and and I don't have a problem from through a capitalist lens with Facebook doing whatever it's doing. I just know that if the table saw people, if their goal was to fragment our attention, they would be causing a lot more injuries.
Well, that's true, yeah.
But I do think, through the lens that we're talking about today, that fragmentation is actually the goal of the algorithm. And I do think it's not the precessional effect. I think it's the primary effect. And the fact that we get to be more interconnected if we block that stuff out is the precessional effect and a nice to have. And that's why I think of, like, where is the line between this kind of parasitic vehicle and the parasite itself, right? The
Right,
involutionary
right.
creature. I'm not we might not be able to answer
Well, I
that
think
here.
we have a version of that problem with every new invention, and it's a version of the law of unforeseen consequences, and then at some point, we blur into a gray zone where people know full well what it's doing, but it's too profitable to stop for them personally.
Yeah.
And that's when we translate from stupidity or ignorance, literally not unforeseen consequences, into an ethical behavior issue. Yeah.
Mhm.
But I still wouldn't give those mechanisms any more agency within themselves than me hitting someone with a shovel and the shovel having agency.
I hear
I think
that.
it's just a cleverly shaped shovel that happens to work really well just for that.
Yeah, 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 right.
Yeah. 'Cause and
The
I say that
technology
because
is neither.
everyone wants to give AI agency. It's like,
Yeah,
no, the only reason that anybody would really wanna say AI has agency is because the people that really have the agency behind the AI don't want to take the responsibility for the agency that they're putting in there, and the same would go for the algorithm from Facebook.
yeah, yeah, there's nothing evil about the algorithm, nor good, but, it's being applied maybe with questionable intent behind it.
Right.
Okay, so I think we've beaten that up enough. So I wanna go back to personal power, because you brought that up a few times in your description of the 3 ways to beat a dragon, to defeat a dragon.
Mhm.
And you talked about gaining personal power by working 40 hours a week with the dragon. So we've talked about personal power before, but I wanna circle back and kind of see if we can describe it for people.
Yeah. Well, I think that personal power has there's an interesting parallel to that in your observation about reading, and that is that people don't read. And because to me, we say read or not read as if you're literate or you're illiterate. But in fact, that's a false duality there because there's a slider there. Because reading is actually a skill that requires development to get past reading the newspaper level of reading, and which most people never get to. and, but it's directly related to personal power, because in a way that people don't understand, that we have sort of sniffed around from a bunch of different ways, and that is that personal power, because language has such a role in meaning, in the world of culture and meaning, our relationship with language directly translates to our personal power. I mean, it's just to me seems incontestable. And so, if people want to do well in the world, I say increase your linguistic abilities. And the best way that I know how to do that, apart from talking with people that are really good at it, is through reading books. That's kind of like the solo version of that. And it's definitely, it's like playing the violin. The more you do, the better you get at it, the faster you are at it, the less painful if people experience that. You know, it is purely just a facility that the more you do, and I'm even talking about this because I hear that people aren't doing it. Like, this would never really, I never would have had this conversation 30 years ago because it seemed real clear. Um,
Well, what Jon Haidt said in the rest of that tweet, he refers to a specific author, Cal Newport. Cal Newport's books are the best. I assigned Deep Work, which must be one of his books, to my undergrad and MBA students. And apparently, Cal Newport, his controversial take is your phone is making you mediocre. He deleted almost every app from his phone, and then he wrote 4 bestsellers in 9 years.
mm, okay. Well, I mean, that seems like a little Mahayana in the approach there, but if it works, it works. I'm not judging, you know. I feel like I can see it both ways. I can see where, yeah, there's ways that I could be more productive, that maybe I am dumping attention into the whole, and maybe not just, I'll just say all media. But at the same time, I feel like it's been a multiplier for a lot of things that I've done. And so, I mean, I don't feel like I monitor my digital behavior the way I monitor my diet, though there is a parallel there, I would say. And I would say Americans aren't very good at that either, in particular. But it's like when I'll turn on YouTube and I could listen to a lecture on Nietzsche, or I could listen to something about the current theater that's going on around me. And, sometimes you go to the fridge and you take out a very nutritious piece of food, and sometimes you grab a piece of cake. You know that if you only grab the cake, you're gonna have flashing on the Hot Pockets and Cartman on the South Park episode.
I had a feeling South Park was about to come up. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And so, which is just like perfectly eloquently shows it right there, and let's thank God we have Cartman to finally manifest that little voice that everybody knows. That's why everybody loves it, because they know this guy from other where, right? Respect my authority. I love it. And but so yeah, I mean, we do, and that is why we have art, isn't it? To reflect on us, the different potential outcomes of human existence, and the different pathos that's involved in there, and to um to sort of manifest this world of possibility and potential, both inside and outside. Yeah.
I I just want to stay with personal power for a minute. Is it a fair summary that personal power is the ability to do hard things?
I think that's kind of what I was getting at, was that we need to actually make ourselves, which means that there's some effort needs to be put in, and some intentionality, some idea of what that looks like. And that has to happen in the light of the intuition that we might have of who we are. And I think that there's a lot of people that don't have that model, and that's a really boring place to end up because you're not going to fulfill potential, not your potential. And I can't say I want to be careful because ambition is a two-edged sword, and people are not always well served by their ambitions. But like I've mentioned before, like the character in, that was the commentator that helped Wilhelm write the I Ching, he said, "We understand a person's character by what aspects of their personalities they choose to develop." Well, if they don't choose to develop any, that tells you something too. And the idea holding yourself as a developable entity, maybe that's something that we get downloaded at an early age or we don't.
Mm.
Um,
That's not a priori.
I wonder. And,
'Cause there are a couple paradoxes in there, like, if you don't fulfill your potential, then how do you know it was even your potential, right? And then the paradox of ambition, and it's funny that you brought up the I Ching because I was just thinking about it, or you brought up Wilhelm. You That's who you mentioned, right?
yeah, Richard Wilhelm, yeah.
Um, and the I Ching refers repeatedly to letting go of ambition, and it's just getting in the way. It's just a product of ego and trying to control nature and your own nature and all of that stuff. And yet, if you choose to take no influence whatsoever and just yin out, then
You
you
will
miss
never
some
cross the great water.
you miss a type of opportunity. Yeah, right.
To cross the great water requires ambition to get to the other side. Yeah. So no, that and this is the mystery of yin and yang. There are times when action is appropriate and times when it's inappropriate. And to know the times is one of the virtues that's attributed to the sage, is that the sage knows the times. He knows when is the time to retire and when is the time to go forth. He knows that sometimes things prosper and sometimes things wane. And that's one of the great virtues of the sage, is to know the times. So, and that's one of the reasons that whenever we have a guest who we think is particularly, well informed, I always want to get their picture on what their knowledge of the times is.
Mhm.
Not so much of the specifics, but of the contextual background that they put it in, because that's where the way and the mechanism whereby they're taking their meaning from it.
Mm.
And I'm saying that, of course, because I'm thinking about our next episode and our guest
Yeah,
coming up. But in general, that's I think a thing. So
yeah. It makes me curious about what I think about the times. And how, often you and I talk about this chapter or that one, and there's a micro also where waking up one day to the next, the times can seem quite different.
mhm, mhm.
Um, so yeah,
Yeah. Well, maybe in the future we can do an episode where we actually throw the I Ching and get a hexagram for the times, and we could
I've
break it
thought of
down.
doing that, and or I've thought of throwing the I Ching, not specifically for that, but I never ask the I Ching a specific question because I just assume that might as well be my ego. So I always ask the I Ching, what the f, and it always has
Yeah,
the
right.
something useful.
Now,
Yeah.
that's my method in general, because I typically am only coming to ask about things that are on my mind in a heavy way. And so for those purposes, I always assume that the I Ching knows what I'm momentarily obsessed with, and then that it'll have a comment just waiting. But I think I could probably cast out just a general theater of snapshot and be curious to see what comes back, and then we could interpret it and explain a little bit about how the I Ching works, maybe for people that aren't familiar with it by
Yeah,
going through
yeah.
it.
No, we can throw it
It might be an
here.
interesting episode.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So circling back to personal power, I think we pretty much agreed it's the capacity to do hard things, and then you had some nice examples and descriptions of that. I assume cultivating personal power is achieved by doing hard things. What is the what is the outcome of having personal power, do you think? How does that look in the world?
Well, it's it's probably a double-edged sword because it obviously means increased responsibility.
Mm.
That goes without saying. But I think at the same time, one, I think that there's something that goes on that, and again, when I say increasing personal power, I mean that in a philosophical way, not in a running a real estate empire, senators listen to my opinion kind of a way. And so that means an aspect of what we've referred to before as expanded consciousness, seeing more of the moving pieces and the more of how they orchestrate. And maybe, I mean, I feel like for myself, there was a path that unfolded that contained experiences that impacted my model of things, my semantic world in such unique ways that integrating those and developing an integrated self within that setting, right? That expanded model of reality, like that was my developmental agenda, right? In other words, it's like I guess I feel like we all have a calling to be authentic to the experience that life has given us somehow, to do it justice, if you will. Now, maybe that may now that's an a priori thing, perhaps. I don't know. That's a question. But it's as if to say I have to do duty to my experience. Maybe it's that striving for coherence. I want to feel that the world that I inhabit is a coherent unity. And so I'm going to keep trying to understand my life experience contextualized by this coherent unity, which the grasp of which is informed by my life experience. You recognize where we're at again is the hermeneutic
A
circle.
hermeneutic circle, yeah.
Yeah. And so, and nowadays, I've been thinking about this. I don't think we would call it a circle. I think if he was cooking that up today, I think we would call it a feedback loop with our much snappier lingo,
Yeah.
because that's really what we're talking about. Because in the modern setting with a feedback loop, we know that that can happen so quickly that we can't track it. And that is what we're talking about, is a resonance with this model of coherence so that, and what am I talking about to put it in practical terms? Okay, you're going about your day, you go around the corner and there's an alien, and I don't mean a undocumented migrant. I mean an actual Roswell style green person, big eyeballs, the whole deal. Okay? Now imagine yourself in that moment. You've had a coherent semantic reality that maybe you thought they exist, maybe you didn't exist, but your experiential reality couldn't tell you one way or the other. So now here you walk around the corner at the Dairy Queen and boom, there's ET. Now you could imagine your mental the pachinko machine. You know the pachinko machines? They're these Japanese machines where the ball drops and it hits a pin and it goes to the left or the right and then it keeps bouncing, bouncing, bouncing down. You could kind of imagine the pachinko machine of your mental configuration having to go through quite a few bounces to have a reintegrated, coherent experience that says, okay, well, maybe these things happen. Maybe the world that I inhabit does bulge out in that way that I had as a dot, 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 maybe, maybe not. Right. I think you could do the same thing. You hear about people having credible Bigfoot encounters. And there's often a very interesting aura to their presence because these are people whose worldviews have gotten jumbled up a bit, right? I'm not saying one way or the other whether it was a guy in a bear suit or not. I'm just saying
But they are clearly impacted.
that the model got jumbled. Yeah, and so life is actually a course of events that jumble that map, and then a lot of space in between. Like, you've heard some people describe their job as hours of boredom punctuated by seconds of abject terror. People talk about being in the army, maybe, and that sort of thing, like hours and hours of waiting, and then you're terrified, and then back to the waiting. And which, life is kind of like that. If we think about, we have a lot of experiences that just reinforce the picture as we already have it. And then every once in a while, there's an event that has to get fit in somehow that did not fit with the old pictures of things. And I think that those things that kind of broaden our base of what's possible and how things work, that's kind of an important part of personal power to
Can
my
you
way of
tie that
thinking
up?
about it.
Can you tie those together a little more?
Well, because of our personal power is directly connected to the leverage of our semantic world. The reason that a
So
mechanic can fix your car when you can is because his semantic world extends and has distinctions and pieces that you haven't dreamed of. And he can work through that and he can make your damn car run and you won't be able to. And same things with all specialized knowledge, right? They've really filled out and detailed these areas that we only have a big black area on the map that says something's obscured by clouds. Today's
monsters
rock and
go
roll
there.
reference.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Pink Floyd. Great movie too, The Valley.
I think that was Syd Barrett's last album, if I remember correctly.
Oh, I wonder. Yeah, could be. But it's interesting because there the idea of the expansion of that semantic model, it tells us where we can go. Like one times Peter, I think I might have mentioned this, he told me he had this book that he couldn't put down. Peter's not a book guy. So I'm like, what? And then he shows me it's an atlas. And he says, see, all the blue in that book is where I can go on my sailboat.
Yeah.
It's like, well, our semantic model is kind of like that, right? The bigger our semantic model, the more places we can go on our sailboat, like the sailboat of consciousness and experience or unfolding our life, right? If uh, if you don't know you can do it, then it doesn't exist for you, right? Like I remember when I was a kid and I was living in New York and I would just get on the highway and I hitchhiked from California and Canada and Florida and I just got on I went anywhere. And then I remember meeting people, some kids in New York City, and they the world outside of New York City did not exist for them in a real way because they did not know how to move in that world or how to go there. There were no details filled in their semantic world about that world. And I realized then that my freedom and related my power was all related to the things that my semantic world enabled me to map and manipulate and put myself in the midst of. Like back in those days, I hitchhiked through 3 Mile Island right when all that went down. And I
Oh,
remember standing under a street lamp, and normally there was just all the bugs and everything flying around the lamps over the highway. No bugs. I did see one of those big male mosquito things, but he was walking. So so yeah, I thought that was interesting. But the idea again is that it's that inner world that enables us. Oh, there's another great rock and roll reference, right? This is, you know who I'm going to say? Bob Marley.
Okay.
Emancipate yourself from mental slavery.
None but ourselves
It
can
is
free our mind.
ourselves that's to free our minds. Exactly. That's the key to personal power is
And
freeing
funny,
our
3 Mile
minds.
Island, have no fear of atomic energy because none of them can stop the time.
No, yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so,
See, that's how mind works. That's how the other half of the brain works, right? That dream.
um, so s so I don't think the scope and scale of our semantic reality explains personal power adequately. I think there are specific areas of semantic reality that have to be pioneered and settled for personal power to change. And there are other areas of semantic reality that are valuable to expand into that don't affect personal power. So you can know everything about
Yeah, yeah.
something, but that doesn't give you gumption necessarily, right?
Well, there's knowing things intellectually, and there's knowing by going through the experience of it.
Yeah.
There's knowing the scales, and there's having played them on your instrument 1,000 times 1,000.
And there's having played
And
them in front of
some
people.
areas right, right. And some places our semantic world, knowing of them doesn't mean we've really integrated them.
Mm.
You know, knowing about something, it's like the famous joke, "Do you know Spanish?" "Oh, yeah, I know Spanish." Do you hear somebody going, "See, hear him talking Spanish? That's Spanish." Well, recognizing Spanish, it turns out, isn't knowing Spanish.
Oh, that's isn't that the
Right.
difference between conocer and, um, saber?
Saber,
And
reconocer.
conocer?
Could be. It
Huh,
could be. To recognize and to
yeah,
know. Yeah.
yeah.
And so yeah, there are some places that we only know because we've had certain experiences, not just had certain thoughts. And I think that's often those two get conflated.
Mm.
And that sometimes we only really know a place to where it lives in our semantic world because we've been there. Like intellectually what it's like to be broke, but that doesn't mean that you know what it's like to be broke
You're
because
using the
there's
second
all these
person, but
emotional components.
I assume you mean it generically because I unfortunately do in fact know what it's like to be broke.
Right, right. And you know that someone who a rich person who intellectually knows that being broke is just having no money, we can easily say they don't get it. They haven't had their kid tug on them saying, "Hey, I wanna need and them go, there's a and this is really a conversation about dimensions of meaning, really. And so yeah, some things are only conveyed to us through very real experiences and not just communicated intellectually. Um,
Cool. Well,
and there's a type of a hermeneutic filter there as well, right? It's like, what's the value of going and working on a farm? It's not just that now you'll know how to grow better tomatoes, right? There's all these other dimensions of meaning that might come along with that. And so parsing our experience, and there's probably a skill set there too, like getting all the juice squeezed out of what you just experienced. I know when I came back from Africa the first time, for a couple weeks, I was like in a, kind of like, what was that? Who was that masked man? That kind of like, what? Kind of readjusting and trying to not even grasping all the different ways my worldview had been impacted by that.
the
And
ceremonies had that effect on me that,
yeah, greatly.
the first X number of ceremonies, I spent a lot of energy trying to extract the meaning consciously. And then at some point, I started trusting that the meaning was precipitating over time and that I just needed to try to stay open to it.
Mhm.
And it became much less of an intentional conscious process and more of a kind of intuitive passive one. And I now that I'm thinking of it, that's how I kind of relate to memory too. Like I I'm not walking around saying to myself, I got to make sure I remember this experience or that one. I'm more
Mhm.
thinking the impact of this experience is sinking in on levels I can't even comprehend. So I'm just going to stay
Yeah.
open to that. And
Yeah.
there's a
And I'm gonna be the person that's post that experience.
right.
Like that I'm
I want to
fomenting
be.
it, maybe.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that idea that meaning, it isn't either you understand it or you don't understand it, like either you can read or you can't read. It's time released. Some meaning is time released. And,
Um,
so some of these things, they do foment within us. And then some meaning happens to us, which is can be disturbingly non-self-directed, and yet I think that that's a big part of the experience of aging, is allowing certain meanings to live through us,
mm.
and um it's a maybe a form of mediumship.
Let's come back to that one in another episode. I'm now
Yeah, that
thinking of
might be.
something you said earlier about how we make ourselves. And there's also this passive intuitive component to how we do that. That's kind of like I think, a sweet way to bookend this conversation about fragmentation.
Yeah. And, if you're not building yourself, somebody else may be
Hmm.
building
Yeah.
something else out of you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Cool. Well, thank you, Brian. That was a pleasure.
Yep. It was a good time, conversation. Good to see or hear everybody, and or say hi to everybody, and who made it this far. And we're really excited for the next episode. So stay tuned by all means. Bring your friends.